Last month, you may recall, David Wood and I debated Anjem Choudhury and Omar Bakri over the question that is the central question of my new book, Did Muhammad Exist? Now, we found that Choudhury and Bakri were not really able to deal with the question. They were only able to answer things like, of course Muhammad existed, it's in the Quran. And so this second episode of the Jihad Watch program will again take up the question, did Muhammad exist, with a new debate, and I think a much more formidable debater. And so once again, we have moderating Chris Conway tonight, and he will set up the program.
Thank you very much, Robert, and good evening, everyone, to this program. Debating him this evening is David Wood. And David is the host of ABM's live talk show. We are going to start this program with a 12-minute opening statement by you, David, and then, of course, following you will be Robert Spencer. We'll start the clock at 12 minutes, and then about 30 seconds before that 12 minutes is up, we'll have a sound that will indicate to you you have 30 seconds to wrap things up. So, David, the program is all you. The topic tonight is, did Muhammad exist? You have 12 minutes. You can start right now.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to thank Robert as well for his new book and for defending his position on ABN tonight. I read Did Muhammad Exist? And I'll be honest, it was way better than I thought it was going to be. I had read Robert's books, The Truth About Muhammad and Religion of Peace, and they were both excellent. But when I heard that Robert, his latest book, would be a challenge to Muhammad's existence, I thought that Robert had finally gone off the deep end. Now that I've read it, I can say that Robert's new book is filled with material that's absolutely essential for anyone interested in the early history of Islam, and especially in the development of the Quran. Every chapter is indispensable. With that said, I still believe in the overall picture of Muhammad that most Westerners who study Islam would believe in. He's born somewhere around 570. He starts delivering revelations to his followers somewhere around 610. He preaches for 12 years or so in Mecca. He flees to Medina. He builds an army. He conquers his enemies, that sort of thing. So I'm not a Muhammad skeptic. But I can say that Robert did affect my confidence level. If someone had asked me, say, 6 months ago, David, how sure are you that Muhammad existed? I would have said, 99.7% sure that Muhammad existed. Whereas if you ask me now, I'd have to say, 90, 92% sure that Muhammad existed. So Robert's book shifted my confidence somewhat, but I still come down heavily on the Muhammad existed side of the debate. Now, why do I believe Muhammad existed after reading Robert's book? Since I just brought it up, in the debate Robert and I had against Anjem Choudhury and Omar Bakri, I said a few words about the historical method, and I'd like to expand on what I said there just a little bit, and then my case for Muhammad's existence will become clear. As I pointed out in that debate, when historians investigate an event or a person from many centuries ago, there are three things they're looking for. First, historians are looking for early sources that were written soon after the events they report. Sometimes we can gather reliable historical information from writings that come 100 or 200 years after an event, but we'd much rather have sources that were written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. The more time that passes before someone writes down what happened, the more time there is for myths and legends to develop. So in general, the earlier, the better. Second, historians like to have multiple sources. One ancient author telling you that something happened is some evidence, and depending on the author, it might even be good evidence. But it's usually not as good as having several ancient authors telling you about the same event. Having a number of different sources allows you to compare and contrast stories, and this can help you weed out bad information. So all else held equal, the more sources you have, the better. Third, historians want these sources to be independent. So think about it. If Robert and Chris and I tell you the same thing, but it's only because Chris and I are repeating something we heard from Robert, you don't really have three separate sources. You have one source, that would be Robert, two people repeat what you said. it would be much stronger if Robert saw something happen and he tells you about it, and Chris saw the same thing for himself and he tells you about it, and I saw it too, so I can tell you. Now, you don't just have one source, you have 3 independent sources. So putting all of these ideas together, when historians try to reconstruct events that happened in the distant past, they'd like to have multiple independent early sources. And when it comes to Muhammad, we don't have that. We don't have anything close to that. We don't have any early detailed biographical sources, let alone multiple independent early biographical sources. There is a massive gaping hole in the historical record that should be filled with references to Muhammad in the Quran, going out supposedly conquering in Muhammad's name. But it isn't filled with those sorts of things. Our stories about Muhammad come from much, much later. The Muslim sources are late, they're biased, and they constantly contradict each other, even on basic detail. So Islam is on very shaky ground historically, and this allows someone like Robert to come in and wreak havoc on people's beliefs about Islam. But I've got some good news for our Muslim viewers. Historians often have to deal with late, biased, unreliable, contradictory sources like the one Muslims are forced to use when they want to learn about their prophet. And historians have developed principles for gathering kernels of truth, even from writings as weak and defective as the Muslim sources. One principle is especially relevant when we try to examine Muhammad's life. It's called the principle of embarrassment. The idea is that when someone admits something that makes him look bad, or makes his belief look bad, it's probably true, because he wouldn't invent something that's embarrassing to him. When people invent things, they invent things that make themselves or their beliefs look good. So when we examine testimony, we can ask ourselves, is this the sort of thing someone would just make up? If it's not the sort of thing someone would make up, have at least some reason to believe that the testimony is accurate. Applying this principle to Muslim sources, Muslims are going to, it's about Muhammad, they're obviously going to fabricate. Applying this principle of embarrassment to the Muslim sources, if Muslims are going to invent things about Muhammad, they're obviously going to invent things that make Muhammad look good, or things that support their particular theological positions, or things that vindicate a certain sect of Islam. And there's no question the Muslim sources are filled with things like this. But the key is Muslims aren't going to invent stories that make Muhammad look stupid or immoral or evil. So when we open the Muslim sources, if we find stories that make Muhammad look bad, the best explanation for why we have these stories is that they really happened. And if they really happened, then Muhammad obviously existed. Now, do we find embarrassing material in the Muslim sources? Of course we do. But as Robert points out in his book, we have to be careful here, because what's embarrassing to Muslims today living in the West wasn't necessarily embarrassing to Muslims nearly 14 centuries ago in Arabia. Muslims in our time are embarrassed by all kinds of things we find in the Quran and the Sirah literature and the Hadith. According to Muslim sources, Muhammad had sex with his 9-year-old child bride, Aisha. He had sex with his slave girls. He allowed his followers to rape their female captives and to have sex with prostitutes and to beat their wives into submission. Muhammad ordered Muslims to assassinate his critics and to execute apostates and to violently subjugate Christians and Jews. He supported his religion by robbing people. He had a man tortured for money. All of this is horribly embarrassing to Muslims in our times, which is why they deny these things. But it wasn't embarrassing to the early Muslim community. So the principle of embarrassment wouldn't really apply here. If these practices were acceptable to Muslims in 7th century Arabia, there's no reason someone couldn't have invented them. But we find other stories in the Muslim sources that are quite different. They were embarrassing even to the early Muslim community. We know they were embarrassing because we find early Muslim historians trying to water down the stories, or to explain them away, or to erase them from history. Let me give you a few examples. First, we know from Muslim records that when Muhammad began receiving revelations, his first impression was that he was demon-possessed. When Muhammad fled the cave of Hira, he was convinced that the first 5 verses of Surah Al-Alaq, the 96th chapter of the Quran, had been put into his head by a poetry demon. What changed his mind? His wife and her cousin convinced him that he wasn't possessed, he was a prophet of Allah. Is this the sort of story Muslims would invent if they want people to believe in Muhammad? I don't think it is. Second, we know that after Muhammad's experience in the cave, he became suicidal and tried to hurl himself off a cliff. Now, if you are manufacturing a prophet to unite the Arab people, do you think you describe him as history's first suicidal prophet? I certainly wouldn't. Third, according to our earliest Muslim sources, Muhammad delivered revelations from the devil. These are the infamous satanic verses. When Muhammad delivered the original version of Surah 53 to his followers, he said that in addition to Allah, there are three goddesses that Muslims can pray to, Allat, Alus, and Manat. Muhammad delivered these verses to his followers. He bowed down in honor of them, and his followers bowed down with him. But a little later, the Prophet of Islam came back and said that these verses, which he had delivered as part of the Quran, weren't really from God, they were from Satan. And he replaced them with the words we find in the Quran today. Now, if you wanted to invent a prophet, wouldn't you portray him as a man who couldn't, wouldn't you portray him as a man who could tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan? I certainly would. Fourth, we know from multiple references in Sahih al-Bukhari and other sources that Muhammad was the victim of black magic that made him delusional and gave him false beliefs. According to the story, one of Muhammad's enemies stole his hairbrush and used it to cast a spell on him. The spell lasted somewhere between 6 months and 2 years. Now, tell me, if you were inventing a prophet to suit your fancy, would you say that his enemies could take him out with a magic spell? Not a chance. Fifth, Surah 4:3 says that Muslims can marry up to 4 women, but the Muslim sources tell us that Muhammad had a lot more than 4 wives. Al-Tabari says that Muhammad consummated marriages with 13 women. We know from references in Bukhari that Muhammad had at least 9 wives at one time. And the reason, according to Islam, that Muhammad got more was that he received a special revelation, Surah 33:50, which gave him and him only special moral privileges, namely lots of wives. Needless to say, if I were inventing a prophet, I wouldn't invent stories that show him violating his own revelations. 6, we have the Zainab story, where Muhammad marries the divorced wife of his own adopted son after Muhammad was the one that broke up the marriage. And the justification, according to the Muslim sources, is so ridiculous we can't help but think that that Muhammad was coming up with revelations in order to justify his behavior. And finally, according to the Quran, Allah rescued Jesus from people who wanted to kill him. So obviously, if we're inventing Muhammad, we're going to have a similarly miraculous end for Muhammad. But how did Muhammad die, according to the Muslim sources? He was poisoned by a Jewish woman whose family had been slaughtered by Muslims. The poison ate away at Muhammad's internal organs for 2 years before he finally died in total agony. Why would Muslims write in their sources that Muhammad's greatest desire was to die in battle and then turn around and tell us that he died at the hands of a Jewish woman? Now, Robert responds to almost all of these in his...
You have about 30 seconds left.
Robert responds to most of these in his book, and he tries to explain reasons why people would have invented them. So Robert agrees with the principle of embarrassment. The difference is going to come down to whether his explanations for why these stories would be invented are the best explanation. I would say that the best explanation for why we have these stories about Muhammad is that, like it or not, no matter how embarrassing they are to Muslims, these things happen. And if they happen, then obviously Muhammad existed.
Okay, we're good. That includes your 15 seconds with a technical error that we had there.
All right.
Thank you very much, David.